regarding trade, yeah, you guys have read the newspaper, you've seen the headlines in terms of the tariffs that are put on goods and the retaliation by China, and then our subsequent retaliation. And the biggest sectors for Iowa that is having an impact on is primarily soybean production and pork production. Those are two primary exports for us. China is a big market for that. There are short-term consequences to that, and we can estimate that. There was a CARD report. CARD is a Center for Ag and Rural Development at Iowa State, and they did a trade report on this. It's a really interesting read if you're into that sort of thing. They estimate Iowa's gross product losses between one to 2 billion of the trade from the trade. Pork losses are about 776 million. That's about 10% of the industry. Soybean losses are the same, about 545 million. That's about 10% of the industry, and that's a short-term perspective. That's using simulations and modeling and very limited scope, short-term, what we expect our losses to be in this state. The bigger problem going forward is not the loss in prices and not the loss in acute trade this year and next year. The bigger problem going forward is that we are no longer a least cost nation. So Iowa agriculture producers are really good at what they do. We have infrastructure, we have a market-based system. We are the best at producing corn and soybeans, we're the best at producing pork, and we have an infrastructure that allows us to export that. We have farmers who invest in technology. Longer term, as this trade war goes on and as other countries aren't taking our goods, what happens is the countries who can't produce at the low cost we can all of a sudden have an opportunity and the time to invest in assets and become that preferred provider in the market. We are losing the time, and that's probably the biggest challenge we are going to face is potentially some of those markets go away. Let's say Brazil figures out, and China is making massive investments in Brazil, so has the US, but China in particular. All they need to do is get their infrastructure in place in Brazil, and they can beat us on soybeans. They can double crop down there. So the longer term challenge, I think, for us in the Midwest and the US is not the acute loss of trade, but it's the longer term loss of entire markets going away and not being able to get those back. We are no longer the least cost producer on a world market of some of the products that we rely on so much in our state.
Thank you.
Yep,
that helps.
From an M&A perspective, supply chain disruption can be a real key factor. Increased costs of sourcing goods, increased costs of shipping goods from new locations make it very difficult for distributors and manufacturers alike to be able to be competitive. So it's critically important that we get this trade issue figured out. And unfortunately, in the environment we're in, I'm not sure what the long-term strategy is. I thought all along, with Terry Branstad being in China as our ambassador, that China and U.S. relationships might be a little rough for a while, but would get better. And I don't know that we've seen that yet. I'm still hoping that's the case. But just as late as yesterday, we heard that the U.S. and China relations on trade took maybe a step backwards, which I think is not good for the U.S. economy. But as long as corporations and businesses in this country are as profitable as they are, and we can keep inflation under control, I see no reason for the market to step back, and I see no reason for there to be a recession anytime in the relatively near future. And in my mind, that's somewhere in that 18 to 24 month period.
I've got to make sure I do this in a balanced way in terms of talking about the overall impact to the U.S. economy of this trade scuffle versus the people that are most injured. And so I went back to my notes from this event 1 year ago, and we were talking about trade. It was the headline news story 1 year ago. And you all know how I feel about our news cycle, no friend Steve, is rarely does something hang around that long. Remember government shutdown in January of this year? Remember that story? Okay, we're not talking about that. But trade has been the headline story and probably will remain so. So what we were talking about then was, is it worth doing? I've got a comment on that in a second. Is it worth doing? What I also said at that meeting was, Iowa hog and soybean producers slight difference. Last year, the enemy was everyone. We would pick on Mexico, our administration would pick on Mexico, Canada, are the best trading partners that a country could ever have. Germany, all of our partners in the world. Now that, roll it forward, where are we now? Well, the enemy has shrunk to one. We've gotten our act together, at least somewhat, with the other countries. Hog and soybean producers are still going to be the ones holding the bag. There's a disproportionate backlash from the Chinese tariffs. That's their only lever they have to pull on an export from us to them. We don't have a lot of goods going out of this country anyway, and not very many of them to China outside of those groups. So is it worth doing? Is it worth fighting this, if you want to call it a trade war? And I won't use my words, but I'll use the words of Mike Pyle, who's now the chief global investment strategist at BlackRock, the largest money manager in the world. So I got to listen to what this guy says. He was in Des Moines and spoke to about 25 or 30 of us in our CFA group earlier this year. The reason that I listened to him is he was Barack Obama's deputy economic secretary on Chinese-U.S. economic and trade relations. So I was like, I've got to go listen to this guy because he was on the front lines, not for the current administration. I want to see what he has to say. He said, policy people in D.C. have been queuing this up, what we're doing right now, they've been queuing it up since Bill Clinton was president. And we thought we'd treat China just like we treated the rest of the world. We'd put our arm around them and show them the ropes and introduce them to Goldman Sachs and teach them how to bank and make trade agreements across borders, and it would all be great. It would march along just like Taiwan and Singapore and South Korea. Well, China never intended to play fair in that arena, and this is his words. And so we had to make a pivot during the Obama administration. They said we're not going to be able to treat China that way anymore. We've got to use more of a club. We've got to hit them with a stick rather than be their friend, because their intention, and it's bared out in fact, was to take the world's technology, copy it, make it cheaper, and create an economy around that. So when I come back to, is it worth fighting? It probably is, because if we don't have a fair, especially in that part of the world that's growing 10 times faster than the US population, India, the Pacific Rim, if we don't have a fair or even a little bit more fair trade, if we can't get paid for the technology that we develop in the United States by the rest of the world, then we're going to slowly fade. I've got some John Deere guys sitting in the back, and I hope they're shaking their heads. I can't see them right now. We need that to be fair for the next 100 years. Otherwise, we're going to lose ground the whole way. So that's where I come back and say, is it worth fighting? Yes, people that we know, that we share a state with, are bearing the brunt of it. And hopefully we get through that okay. But it is worth fighting for. On the bigger picture, which of course is our job here in the publicly traded marketplace, it is a very small percentage of our net GDP that's being impacted dollar-wise by the tariffs so far. So the consumers, it's not China paying the tariffs either, it's the consumers and the importers are paying a little bit more. But some protectionist businesses that are getting protected on their prices are actually seeing a little bit of a lift. So it's a net effect of a fraction of our GDP when you look at the net effect. I have to look at the world that way. So I do have to set aside the Iowa farmers getting kicked in